This is the founding father of the Dutch East India Company, and his story is nothing short of shocking. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt wasn't just a politician, he was the driving force behind the creation of the world's first great multinational corporation. This sharp-minded lawyer became one of the most powerful statesmen in the Dutch Republic through a gamble that grew into a vast empire of ships, spices, and silver. When his company became a global powerhouse, its pursuit of profit unleashed both brilliance and brutality. But unlike the Dutch East India Company, its founding father met a shocking end that will leave you speechless. Background and early life of Johan van Oldenbarnevelt. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was born in 1547 in the Dutch town of Amersfoort. It was a turbulent century in Europe. There were wars of religion, shifting alliances, and empires clashing for power. Into this chaos arrived Johan, the son of a reasonably well-off family, with enough means to give him a proper education. From early on, he stood out for his sharp mind and a restless ambition that didn't sit still for small-town life. His education was as international as it gets for a young Dutchman of that time. He studied law at Leuven, then traveled further afield to universities in Heidelberg, Bourges, and even Padua in Italy. These weren't just academic detours. They exposed him to different political philosophies, ideas about statecraft, and a network of contacts that would serve him later. When he returned to the Netherlands, Johan began practicing law. He quickly built a reputation as someone who could untangle complex cases and navigate the messy overlap of law and politics. But his career really took off when he tied his fortunes to the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. He wasn't a soldier on the battlefield. He was a strategist, helping to shape the legal and diplomatic arguments that underpinned the rebellion. During the Siege of Haarlem, and later the Relief of Leiden, Johan's counsel was noted. He showed himself to be a man who could operate under pressure and balance ideals with hard pragmatism. By the 1580s, Johan's rise seemed unstoppable. He became pensionary of Rotterdam, and then in 1586, the land's advocate of Holland. This was effectively the highest civilian post in the province, and one of the most powerful positions in the Dutch Republic. From this seat, he would steer the young republic through some of its most decisive years. And it was here, with war still raging and trade routes shifting, that he began to see the possibilities of uniting Dutch merchants into something much bigger than loose trading ventures. Early moves toward trade and statecraft. By the time Johan van Oldenbarnevelt stepped into his role as land's advocate in 1586, the Dutch Republic was still a fragile experiment. The war against Spain was draining, and unity among the provinces was shaky at best. Johan's job was not only to hold the political pieces together, but also to find new ways to fund the fight, and that meant trade. The late 1500s were a wild era for Dutch merchants. Independent pre-companies called Voorcompagnieën were sending ships to Asia, competing fiercely with each other for spices, silks, and porcelain. Each voyage was high risk. Storms, pirates, disease, and hostile Portuguese traders were constant threats. Some expeditions made fortunes, others collapsed in debt. To Johan, this chaos looked unsustainable. The Dutch needed coordination, not a knife fight between rival merchants. As a lawyer and statesman, Johan saw the bigger picture. He knew that a fractured trade effort weakened the Dutch in their struggle with Spain and left them vulnerable to foreign rivals. He began to push for something radical, a merger of all those competing companies into a single united enterprise, a monopoly. That way, Dutch traders could pool resources, share risks, and present a united front overseas. But this wasn't just about economics. Johan understood that trade could fuel the war chest. Every bag of nutmeg or pepper sold in Amsterdam meant more funds for ships, soldiers, and fortifications back home. If the Republic wanted independence, trade had to pay for it. And so, Johan began negotiating with merchant leaders, provincial estates, and the States General to make his vision a reality. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Rival merchants resisted. Everyone was afraid of losing control. Provinces squabbled over where power would sit. But Johan's political skill and his ability to balance interests, smooth egos, and draft binding agreements kept the plan alive. He wasn't just thinking like a politician anymore. He was thinking like a founder. By the turn of the century, his efforts were gaining momentum. The Dutch were tired of infighting, and the lure of greater profits was irresistible. The stage was set for a single chartered company that could dominate the seas. And in 1602, thanks to Johan's relentless pushing, the Dutch East India Company would be born. Founding the VOC. The year was 1602. The The Dutch Republic was still at war with Spain. Across the provinces, merchants were restless. They'd grown tired of fighting one another on the high seas while the Portuguese and Spanish carved up the spice trade. That's when Johan van Oldenbarnevelt stepped in with his boldest idea yet. Let's unite the merchants, pool their wealth, and give them one charter under the protection of the state. What he engineered was nothing less than revolutionary. Under Johan's guidance, the States General granted the new Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie a sweeping charter. This wasn't just a trading license, it was a blank check. The VOC had the right to wage war, build forts, sign treaties, and even mint its own coins. No other private company in the world had ever been given such powers. In practice, it was a state within a state, and Johan was the man who made it happen. Rival merchants who had once competed fiercely were now folded into this single giant enterprise. The capital structure was ingenious. Instead of relying only on wealthy backers, the company raised funds by offering shares to the public. Anyone with money could buy in. That first subscription, the world's first IPO in modern terms, raised an enormous sum. It gave the VOC both capital and credibility. For the first time, a company's ownership was spread among hundreds of investors, each expecting dividends from distant spice islands. At the top sat the Heren 17, the Lord 17. They would run the VOC's affairs. They balanced the interests of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Zeeland, and other port cities, but always with one goal: profit. And profit in those early years came quickly. Ships returned loaded with pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and silks, selling for sums that made early investors rich. But here's the part most people miss. Johan's hand in all this wasn't just financial. He saw the VOC as an extension of the Republic's war effort. Every fortified trading post abroad wasn't just about commerce. It was a strike at Spain and Portugal to break their grip on global trade routes. The VOC, in Johan's mind, was both a business and a weapon. Still, with such sweeping powers, cracks began to appear early. Some governors abroad acted like kings. Forts turned into mini-states. Local resistance to Dutch monopolies grew fierce. And VOC ships often needed cannons as much as cargo holds. The marriage of profit and power was intoxicating, but also dangerous. For now, though, the gamble worked. By the mid-1600s, the VOC was turning enormous profits and securing its place as the backbone of Dutch wealth. Amsterdam blossomed into a global financial hub, and its stock exchange buzzed with VOC shares. While investors toasted their dividends, Johan must have felt vindicated. His great experiment was alive. But success comes with a cost. The VOC's rapid rise would soon reveal both its genius and its dark side. Rise and golden age of the VOC. Once the ink was dry on that 1602 charter, the VOC wasted no time showing the world what it could do. In its first decade alone, dozens of ships sailed out from Dutch harbors bound for Asia. Their holds were stacked with silver, and hopes of returning with spices worth 10 times the investment. And for a while, it worked like magic. Investors at home were stunned at the profits. Dividends of 20, even 40%, weren't unheard of. The company quickly became the pride of the Dutch Republic. But the VOC wasn't just a fleet of trading vessels. It became something far more powerful. In 1619, the company founded Batavia, today's Jakarta, on the island of Java. This wasn't a trading post. It was a fortified city, complete with warehouses, defenses, and administration buildings. From here, the VOC could control trade routes across the Indonesian archipelago. Batavia became the beating heart of Dutch power in Asia. Control of the spice trade was the ultimate prize, and the VOC pursued it with ruthless focus. On the Banda Islands, the only place on Earth where nutmeg grew, Dutch forces waged brutal campaigns to eliminate competition. Local resistance was crushed, often with shocking violence. Entire communities were wiped out or enslaved to secure a monopoly. For investors back home, it was easy to ignore the blood behind the profit margins. For the people in Asia, the VOC was not just a trader, but a conqueror. And yet, for decades, this strategy worked. Dutch ships dominated routes from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. The company secured clove supplies from the Moluccas, cinnamon from Ceylon, textiles from India, and tea from China. Each product was funneled back to Amsterdam and fed Europe's growing appetite for exotic goods. Above all, it cemented Dutch wealth. Ordinary citizens could now speculate on global trade, something unheard of just years earlier. The VOC's success rippled far beyond the trading floor. Dutch shipbuilding thrived to meet the company's demand for sturdy vessels. Ports like Amsterdam and Middelburg bustled with workers, sailors, carpenters, and merchants. The money flow financed Dutch art, science, and architecture. In short, it fueled the Netherlands' golden age. Without the VOC, Rembrandt's patrons and the canals of Amsterdam might never have existed. But even in its glory, there were cracks. Corruption seeped into the company's sprawling bureaucracy. Governors overseas often grew rich by skimming profits or running side deals. Communications between Amsterdam and Batavia took months, meaning directors in Holland had little control over what their men were doing half a world away. The Heeren 17 back home might have thought they were steering the ship, but in reality, local commanders often acted as kings. Another challenge came from competition. The English East India Company was founded just 2 years before the VOC, and it was determined to break Dutch dominance. Skirmishes erupted in Asian waters. Trade wars spilled over into actual wars between nations. For a time, the VOC held the upper hand, but the rivalry forced it to spend heavily on fortifications, fleets, and soldiers. That meant rising costs, even as investors demanded high dividends. Still, for over a century, the VOC stood as the world's first corporate superpower. It was a business, a military force, and a colonial authority all rolled into one, and it left a complicated legacy. On the one hand, there was wealth and innovation. On the other hand, violence and exploitation. Eventually, the weight of these contradictions would become too heavy. Corruption, competition, and mounting debt would drag the company down. And just as the VOC began to stumble, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the man who helped create it, faced his own shocking downfall. Decline, crises, and dissolution. For more than a century, the Dutch East India Company had seemed unstoppable. But like so many giants, its greatest strength eventually became its undoing. The VOC had built a global empire with ships, soldiers, and silver, but managing such a sprawling machine was expensive. By the 18th century, the cracks were no longer hidden. One of the biggest problems was cost. Maintaining forts, garrisons, and fleets across Asia drained the company's treasury. Wages for thousands of sailors and soldiers, along with constant wars against local rulers and rival Europeans, swallowed profits. The easy money days of the spice monopoly were over. Markets were shifting. Competitors, especially the English East India Company, grew stronger, and it cut into Dutch dominance. Then came corruption. With its headquarters half a world away from its colonies, the VOC could never fully control its governors. Many officials lived like kings. They avariciously lined their pockets with bribes or sold favors to local merchants. Reports of mismanagement flowed back to Amsterdam, but by the time they arrived, the damage was already done. Shareholders in the Dutch Republic demanded steady dividends, and the directors kept paying them, sometimes by borrowing. And this dug the company deeper into debt. The numbers tell the story. By the mid-17th century, profits had turned into losses. Debt piled up to staggering levels, while the value of VOC shares dropped. Attempts at reform came too late. A company once hailed as the pride of the Dutch Republic was now a bloated bureaucracy, weighed down by inefficiency and mistrust. Meanwhile, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the man who had pushed for the company's creation, never lived to see this decline. His own story had already ended in tragedy. Back in 1619, political tensions with Prince Maurice of Orange boiled over. Johan's moderate stance in a fierce religious conflict, the Arminians versus the Contra-Remonstrants, left him isolated. Accused of treason, he was tried in a highly biased court. Despite decades of service to the Republic, Johan was sentenced to death. At 71 years old, he was executed by beheading in The Hague. It's a shocking twist. The founder of the Dutch Republic's greatest corporate weapon, the man who engineered its first multinational giant, was cut down by the very state he had served. His creation, the VOC, would survive for almost 2 centuries after his death. But by 1799, even that empire collapsed, and its assets were nationalized by the Dutch government. What began as a bold dream of unity and profit ended in bankruptcy, blood, and betrayal. And yet, the legacy of both Johan van Oldenbarnevelt and the VOC continues to echo in the way we think about corporations and capitalism today. A parting shot. When you look back at Johan van Oldenbarnevelt's story, it's impossible not to be struck by the ironies. Here was a man who fought for Dutch independence, who believed in law, order, and pragmatic compromise, and who engineered one of the boldest experiments in global trade. He gave the Dutch Republic a tool that turned it into a world power. And yet, his own life ended without honor, with an executioner's sword on a cold morning in The Hague. The VOC itself followed a strangely similar arc. Born out of chaos, sharpened by ambition, and fueled by profit, it became the first great multinational corporation. It transformed Amsterdam into the financial center of the world, introduced the concept of public stock markets, and made ordinary citizens investors in global trade. At the same time, it built its fortune on monopoly, violence, and exploitation that left scars in Asia that lasted long after the company disappeared. By the late 1700s, the VOC collapsed under its own weight. Corruption, competition, and unsustainable costs turned the once mighty giant into a financial corpse. Its remains were absorbed by the Dutch state, a humbling end for what had been the pride of a nation. And so we're left with a paradox. The man who helped shape the Republic was executed as a traitor, and the company he inspired became a symbol of both brilliance and brutality. Together, they left behind a story that is as shocking as it is instructive, a reminder that empire, whether built by swords or shares, always carries a price. Do you think the VOC's model, part corporation, part empire, was visionary genius or a dangerous blueprint for abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear. For now, we're done. Catch you next time.